Shabbat Shalom, and welcome to Secrets Revealed, the Holy Bible. This channel, we look at the truth about the scriptures, specifically the authoritative voice of scripture, as it is known today, the King James Bible. 99% of Bibles come from the Masoretic text, a translation that was developed after the death of Jesus Christ. And was only completed 1,000 years after his death. So the Septuagint is what we focus on. We look at that version of scriptures and compare it side by side with the Masoretic text. The Septuagint, again, was the authoritative voice of scripture because it existed 300 years before Jesus Christ lived as a human being. So without further ado, we're going to look at Deuteronomy chapter 8. There are 20 verses in this chapter. Beginning in verse 1, we have an omission of the word your God or Elohim. Verse 2, an addition of these 40 years. There it is right there. And a big difference here is afflict, that he might afflict you versus humble you. So it's one thing to humble yourself or to be humbled, but to be afflicted, that speaks of a different thing altogether. And it says here that the things in your heart might be made manifest. So these things would come out versus to know what was in your heart. Verse 3, continuous difference of afflicted versus humbled, continues. We see straitened versus suffered. And a big difference here is an addition of which you knew not. So this manna saying you did not know it. Is this not a contradiction? We have an omission of the word by every word. It's not actually there. That was only inserted because the Septuagint exists, so they knew what to put there. We see Elohim versus Yah. So this is one of the few circumstances or situations where, or one of the few instances, I should say, where the tetragrammaton is replaced with Elohim. And then we see shall man live versus does man live. No, he doesn't live by that by default. That's the real way to live, is by his words. Moving on to verse 4. An omission of your shoes were not worn off from off you. And a significant difference is your feet were hardened versus they swell up. They did not swell up, I should say. And an omission of look, these 40 years, or lo in the Old English. Verse 5, know versus consider. So you will realize, instead of just you will think about it. An omission of as if any man, but here it is versus as a man. So the word if any has been omitted. Verse 7, another omission here, will bring you, in conjunction with the word bring you. An omission of extensive land, extensive. Torrents versus brooks. Fountains versus deep places. Or I should say fountains of deep places versus fountains and depths. Plains and mountains versus valleys and hills. Verse 8, we have an addition of trees in regards to figs. Verse 9, you shall not eat bread with poverty versus you shall not eat bread without scarceness. So Septuagint seems to be saying you will eat a lot of bread. The Masoretic seems to be saying you will not eat a lot of bread. That's the way I interpret it, but please let me know in the comment section below how you interpret that. Mountains versus hills. Verse 10, and you shall eat versus when you have eaten. So one is saying this will happen versus when this happens, it may not happen, but when this happens. Significant difference says bless Yah on the good land versus bless Yah for the good land. Um, verse 11, take heed to yourselves versus beware. Verse 12, omit and omission of dwelt in them, have dwelt in them. Verse 13, oxen versus herds. An omission here to you, multiplied to you. It's not just multiplied in general, but to you. That's the ownership is yours. Another omission, your possessions, multiplied to you. So this is talking about specifically possessions. Verse 14, be exalted in heart uh, versus your heart be lifted up. So similar meaning. Verse 15, biting serpent versus fiery serpent. This implies it may not have been shining ones or the nakash in Hebrew. Nakash, I think. I'm not sure you pronounce that, but anyhow, that's an interesting difference there. A fountain of water versus water. So just water trickling, but no, there's a fountain gushing. Verse 16, an omission of which you knew not. Okay, so it appears that they did not know it. So maybe it is along the same line. Continuous difference of afflict versus humble. An omission of thoroughly try you versus prove you. So it's one thing to prove something, but to thoroughly try someone is fully to the fullest extent. Latter days versus latter end. Verse 17, lest versus and. Unless you should say in your heart versus and you say in your heart. An omission of should say. You should say. My strength versus my might. Wrought versus gotten. An omission of the tetragrammaton once again in verse 18. I should say strength versus power first, and then an omission of the tetragrammaton in the second half of the verse. Verse 19, big difference here. I call heaven and earth to witness against you, versus I testify against you. So Elohim is testifying against them, but here he's calling two witnesses, heaven and earth, to be witnesses. And that's all I have for this video. So thank you very much for your time. May God bless you and make your way prosperous, and peace unto you from our Father Elohim and Yeshua HaMashiach. You've been watching Secrets Revealed, the Holy Bible.